Before we begin, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you can. Put on your headphones. What I'm about to tell you happened to a man named Daniel Reeve, a 38-year-old electrician from a quiet town outside Manchester. I've changed a few details to protect the people still living through the aftermath of this story. But everything else is exactly as he told it to me. This is the story of the last phone call he ever wanted to receive, and the first one that made him wish he'd never picked up a phone again. If tonight's story kept you company, consider subscribing and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Settle in. Let's begin. Daniel married Claire when he was 26. She was the kind of woman people described as steady. Not boring. Steady. The type who remembered your coffee order after meeting you once, who kept a spare umbrella in her car for strangers caught in the rain, who hummed old songs while she did the dishes, always slightly off-key, always the same 3 songs on rotation. They were married for 11 years when the accident happened. It was a Tuesday in October. Claire was driving home from her sister's house along the same B road she'd taken 1,000 times before. The police report said a delivery van crossed the center line on a bend. They said it was instant. They always say that. Daniel told me later that instant is a word people use to make the living feel better, not to describe what actually happens to a body in a car at 60 miles an hour. He didn't remember much of the funeral. He remembered the smell of the flowers, too sweet, almost sickening. He remembered shaking hands with people he didn't recognize. He remembered coming home that night to a house that still smelled like her shampoo, and sitting on the edge of the bed for 4 hours without moving. Grief for Daniel didn't arrive as sadness. It arrived as silence. The house had always been full of small sounds. The radio in the kitchen, her phone buzzing with messages from her sister, the particular creak of the 3rd stair that she always forgot to avoid. And now, there was nothing. Just Daniel, and the walls, and the quiet. He told me the silence was the worst part. Worse than the funeral. Worse than clearing out her side of the wardrobe, which took him nearly a year to do. The silence sat in every room like something with weight. Something that had moved in the day Claire moved out. 6 months passed this way. Daniel went back to work. He smiled at the right times. He told people he was doing as well as could be expected, which is another one of those phrases that means nothing and everything at once. And then, on a Thursday night in April, at exactly 11:47 p.m., his phone rang. He was lying in bed, not sleeping, just staring at the ceiling the way he had most nights since October. The phone was on the nightstand, screen dark, and then suddenly it wasn't dark anymore. It lit up the room in that cold blue-white way phones do at night. And the ringtone, her ringtone, the one he'd never bothered to change, cut through the silence like something breaking. He looked at the screen. Daniel said his first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. A practical, mechanical kind of confusion. The kind you feel when something doesn't match the world you know to be true. Claire's phone had been destroyed in the accident. He knew this because the police had returned her personal effects to him in a sealed plastic bag, and the phone inside it was cracked into 3 pieces, the screen a spider's web of shattered glass. He'd kept that phone in a drawer. He hadn't thrown it away because throwing it away felt like a kind of second death. But he also hadn't charged it, hadn't turned it on, hadn't done anything with it in 6 months. And yet here it was. Her name, her contact photo, a picture from their honeymoon in Cornwall, her laughing with her hair blown sideways by the wind, filling his screen. He didn't answer it the first time. He told me he just watched it ring, 4 times, 5 times, his heart going so hard he could feel it in his throat. And then it stopped. He didn't sleep that night. He told himself it was a glitch, a scam call that had somehow spoofed her number. People can do that, he reasoned. Spoofing is a real thing. Scammers do it constantly. That was the explanation his mind reached for, because the alternative wasn't something his mind was ready to hold. The next morning, in the daylight, with tea in his hands and the birds outside doing their ordinary business, it was easier to believe the glitch theory. He almost convinced himself. Almost. Because 2 nights later, at 11:47 p.m. again, the exact same time to the minute, his phone rang again. This time, Daniel answered it. He told me that in the half second before he pressed the green button, some old animal part of his brain screamed at him not to do it. He ignored it. Grief makes people do things that fear would normally stop. He put the phone to his ear and said, "Hello?" There was a pause. Then breathing. Soft, familiar breathing. The kind you only recognize after years of falling asleep next to someone. And then a voice said, "Danny?" He said hearing that name nearly stopped his heart. Nobody called him Danny. Nobody except Claire. His mother called him Daniel. His mates called him Dan. Only Claire, in 11 years of marriage, had ever called him Danny. And only in private. Only in quiet moments. Only when it was just the two of them. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. The voice on the other end continued, soft and a little unsure, exactly the way Claire used to sound when she called him from somewhere loud, trying to be heard. "Danny, it's freezing out here. Can you come get me?" He said his hands were shaking so badly, he nearly dropped the phone. He asked, barely a whisper, "Claire?" "Yeah," the voice said like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Who else would it be? And then the call cut off, not gradually, not like a bad signal fading. It simply stopped, mid-breath, the way a candle goes out when someone pinches the wick. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed for the rest of the night. He didn't cry. He told me he was too frightened to cry. Fear and grief, he said, occupy the same space in your chest, and that night, fear had claimed all of it. The next day, Daniel did what any reasonable person would do. He went to his phone provider. He explained, as calmly as he could manage, that he was receiving calls from a number belonging to someone who had passed away, and he wanted to know how that was possible. The woman at the desk was kind but confused. She pulled up his call log on her system. There were no incoming calls from Claire's number. Not that night. Not 2 nights before. Nothing. Daniel told her that was impossible. He'd seen it on his screen. He'd heard the ringtone. He'd had a full conversation. She turned the monitor toward him so he could see for himself. His call history showed nothing between 11:30 p.m. and midnight on either night. As far as the network was concerned, his phone had not rung at all. He left the shop feeling like the ground had shifted slightly under him, like the world he'd been standing on wasn't quite as solid as he'd believed. That night, he did something he hadn't done since the funeral. He opened the drawer where he kept Claire's shattered phone, and he took it out. The screen was still cracked into 3 uneven pieces. He pressed the power button anyway, more out of instinct than expectation. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. The phone was dead. Had been dead for 6 months. Its battery long since drained. Its internals likely damaged beyond repair from the crash. He put it back in the drawer and closed it. But he told me that as he closed the drawer for just a moment, he thought he felt warmth coming from inside it, like the plastic had been holding heat. He told himself it was his imagination. He wanted very badly for it to be his imagination. 2 nights later, at 11:47 p.m., the phone rang again. Daniel began keeping a notebook after that. He wrote down every detail of every call, partly to convince himself he wasn't losing his mind, and partly because some instinct told him this was evidence. Though evidence for what, or for whom, he couldn't say. The calls came every 2 to 3 nights, always around the same time, always between 11:40 and midnight. And each time, the conversation went a little further than the last. In the second real call, Claire's voice asked him if he remembered their anniversary trip to the Lake District, a detail Daniel had never posted anywhere, never told anyone outside the two of them. She described the bed and breakfast they'd stayed in, the owner's dog that kept following them on walks, the rain that ruined their first attempt to see Windermere. In the third call, she asked him why he hadn't come to get her yet. Her voice had changed slightly. Still hers, still familiar, but with an edge underneath it, like something straining to stay calm. In the fourth call, she told him exactly where she was. "I'm on the bend," she said. "Past the old mill. It's so cold, Danny." "Why haven't you come?" "The bend past the old mill was where the accident happened." Daniel told me that by this point, he'd stopped sleeping properly. He'd stopped eating properly. His sister noticed the change first. The hollowed look under his eyes, the way he flinched whenever his phone buzzed for any reason, even a text from a delivery company. She asked him what was wrong, and for the first time he told someone. She didn't believe him, not at first. She suggested grief counseling gently, the way you'd suggest something to someone you were worried might break. Daniel didn't argue with her, but he also didn't stop answering the calls. Because here is the thing he admitted to me, quietly, near the end of our conversation. The thing he was almost ashamed to say out loud. Some part of him didn't want the calls to stop. Some part of him needed to hear her voice, even if hearing it meant something was deeply, terribly wrong. Grief, left alone long enough in an empty house, will take almost anything over more silence. On the 9th call, Claire asked him to come and get her. Not "can you" this time, not a question. She said it flatly, like an instruction. "Come and get me, Danny. I've been waiting long enough." Daniel told me that something about her tone that night was different, colder. The warmth that had been in her voice during the earlier calls, the warmth that had convinced him, deep down, that this really was her, had thinned into something flatter, something that sounded like her voice, but had stopped bothering to sound like her feelings. He got in his car at midnight and drove to the bend past the old mill. The road was empty, no streetlights out that far, just his headlights cutting through the dark and the hedgerows pressing in close on either side. He said the drive felt long, in a way that didn't match the actual distance, like the road was stretching itself out on purpose, giving him time to change his mind. He didn't change his mind. When he reached the bend, he pulled over onto the verge and turned off the engine. The headlights stayed on, throwing 2 cones of pale light onto the wet tarmac ahead. He sat there for a long moment, his hands still on the wheel, his heart slamming against his ribs. Then his phone rang. He answered it, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here." "I know," the voice said. "I can see you." Daniel said that was the moment true terror finally arrived. Not fear, not dread, but a full physical terror that flooded through him like ice water. Because the voice hadn't come from his phone speaker, it had come from just behind his right shoulder. Inside the car. He didn't turn around right away. He told me that not turning around was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Harder than identifying her body. Harder than the funeral. Harder than any single moment of the 6 months before. Every instinct told him to look. Every instinct also told him that looking would be the last mistake he ever made. The voice spoke again, closer now, almost at his ear. "You took so long, Danny." He said the temperature in the car dropped so fast, his breath started fogging in front of him. The radio, which hadn't been on, crackled to life with static, then cut out completely. The headlights flickered once, twice, then held steady again. He finally turned his head. There was nothing there. The back seat was empty. But he said the air itself seemed to ripple, the way heat ripples off a road in summer. Except this was cold, not heat. A distortion in the air, shaped roughly like a person sitting where no person was. And then, from that empty space, her voice said one more thing. "You should have come sooner. Now it's too late for both of us." The passenger door, which he swore he had locked, opened on its own, slowly, deliberately. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it a smell he recognized instantly and would never be able to forget. The smell of Claire's shampoo. The same one that had lingered in the house for weeks after she died, except now mixed with something underneath it, something metallic and wrong. Daniel didn't wait to see what came next. He turned the key, threw the car into gear, and drove away from that bend faster than he had ever driven in his life, not daring to look in the rearview mirror once. He didn't go home that night. He drove to his sister's house and sat in her driveway until sunrise, too shaken to knock, too shaken to be alone. When she found him there in the morning, wrapped in his coat, staring blankly through the windscreen, she finally understood that whatever was happening to her brother was more than grief. He told her everything. This time she listened differently. She'd heard days before about a local news story, a delivery driver who'd been involved in a fatal crash on that same stretch of road. The driver who had crossed the center line into Claire's lane. What she hadn't told Daniel, because she hadn't wanted to give him one more thing to carry, was that the driver had died as well. 3 days after the crash in hospital, from injuries he never recovered from. Daniel hadn't known that. In 11 months, nobody had ever told him the other driver had died too. He asked his sister why that mattered. She said she didn't know, but something about it sat wrong with both of them. The idea that 2 people had died on that same bend, in the same crash, within days of each other, and only one of them, apparently, had stopped calling. The phone calls continued for 2 more weeks after that night, each one shorter, each one colder. Claire's voice, if it was still her voice at all, grew less like a wife missing her husband, and more like something wearing her voice the way you'd wear a coat that no longer fit quite right. On the final call, she didn't ask him to come anymore. She simply said, "I'm not alone out here, Danny, and soon neither will you be." The line went dead, and it never rang again. Daniel moved out of that house 4 months later. He sold Claire's shattered phone, or rather, he tried to. He told me the man who came to collect it for parts refused to take it once he opened the case, and found the internal battery completely melted, fused into the casing, though the phone had never once been charged or powered on since the accident. Nobody has ever been able to explain that to him, nor the missing call logs, nor the temperature drop in his car, nor the smell that lingered in his vehicle for nearly a month afterward, no matter how many times he cleaned it. Daniel doesn't believe anymore that it was simply Claire calling him from wherever the dead go. He's come to believe something else, something he says keeps him up some nights even now. He believes that whatever answered using her voice wasn't her at all. He believes it was something that found her at the moment of her death, learned everything it needed to know from what was left of her, and used all of that, her voice, her memories, her love for him, as a kind of key, a way to reach through to someone still living, someone still grieving, someone with a door left open just wide enough. He told me grief is exactly that, an open door, and some things out there, he says, know exactly how to knock. Daniel still lives in the same town. He's remarried his phone provider 3 times, changed his number twice, and yet, he told me this quietly, almost as an afterthought, right at the end of our final conversation. Every few months, late at night, his phone will still light up. No caller ID, no name, just a number he doesn't recognize. He's never answered it again, but he told me that sometimes, in the seconds before it stops ringing, he swears he can still hear breathing on the other end. Soft, familiar, waiting. That's the story Daniel told me, word for word, as close as memory allows. Whether you believe every detail of it is, as always, up to you. If tonight's story kept you company, consider subscribing and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Whether it's a quiet night in the UK, a late evening in the US, or the early hours of the morning in Australia, I read every single one. And if your phone rings tonight from a number you don't recognize, maybe let it ring out. Sleep well. I'll see you in the next one.